You are told that getting a 30-year mortgage is responsible homeownership and equity building. What if I told you that wealthy people avoid mortgages entirely? This sounds logical because mortgages make homeownership accessible and build equity over time. But something's wrong when mortgage payments enrich banks more than homeowners. Most financial advice emphasizes leveraging mortgages for homeownership and long-term wealth building strategies. Why do mortgage companies push 30-year terms while wealthy buyers prefer cash purchases? Mortgage financing appears beneficial because it enables homeownership without requiring full cash payment. But what if 30-year loans maximize bank profits rather than homeowner benefits? Think about your mortgage payment breakdown and how much goes to interest. Does most of your payment build equity or pay bank profits? The mortgage trap operates by convincing people that debt creates homeownership while hiding costs. If you want to understand why wealthy people avoid mortgage interest while others pay banks, subscribe to Prof. Jung Explained and share this with someone making mortgage payments. They need to see why 30-year loans benefit lenders more than borrowers. The system creates different relationships with property ownership depending on your financing approach. When we say homeownership, we mean different financial structures based on debt versus cash. For mortgage buyers, homeownership means making monthly payments to banks for decades. They pay interest first and principal later, while banks collect steady income. They believe equity building justifies interest costs and long-term payment obligations to lenders. For cash buyers, homeownership means immediate full ownership without ongoing payment obligations to lenders. They avoid interest costs completely and own property outright from purchase date. They understand that avoiding debt often provides better financial outcomes than leverage. Think about owning your home immediately versus paying banks for 3 decades. Consider immediate ownership versus gradual equity building through interest payments over time. This explains how different homeownership approaches affect long-term wealth outcomes and ownership. The difference isn't about housing versus renting, but different relationships with debt. But here's where it gets interesting about mortgage structures and wealth extraction mechanisms. The trap doesn't just charge interest on borrowed money for property purchases. It actually structures payments to maximize bank profits while minimizing homeowner equity building. Mortgage amortization schedules. Front-load interest payments during early years when homeowners pay mostly. This creates what economists call equity delay, where ownership builds slowly despite payments. Meanwhile, banks receive maximum interest income during periods when homeowners can afford. Consider how your early mortgage payments affected equity building versus interest payments over time. The mortgage trap becomes sophisticated when examining how it handles refinancing and payment optimization. Mortgage companies encourage refinancing when interest rates drop or home values increase. This refinancing resets payment schedules and extends profitable interest collection periods for lenders. The refinancing cycle creates what bankers call payment restart, where equity building resets. Homeowners restart 30-year payment schedules despite previous equity accumulation and ownership progress. Meanwhile, cash buyers avoid refinancing costs and maintain full ownership regardless of rates. Do you find refinancing saving money or extending debt obligations to lenders? What happens to total interest paid when refinancing resets payment schedules completely? The mortgage trap exploits what behavioral economists call payment normalization in homeownership expectations. People become accustomed to mortgage payments as normal homeownership costs rather than profit. More payment duration feels acceptable because homeownership seems to require debt obligations. This normalization prevents people from calculating total interest costs over full loan terms. Accepting 30-year payments prevents recognition that cash purchases often cost less overall. Meanwhile, wealthy buyers calculate total costs rather than just monthly payment affordability. The mortgage trap creates what psychologists call ownership illusion, where payments feel like progress. People believe mortgage payments create equity building and ownership advancement over time effectively. This illusion prevents recognition that early payments primarily benefit banks rather than homeowners. Payment illusion also prevents people from understanding actual ownership timelines and equity accumulation. Meanwhile, cash buyers understand immediate ownership advantages and avoid gradual equity illusions. They can benefit from full ownership rather than payment-based ownership over decades. The mortgage trap creates debt normalization that makes borrowing feel responsible rather than risky. People become comfortable with mortgage obligations because debt seems normal for homeownership completely. This comfort prevents consideration of cash purchase options that avoid interest entirely. Debt acceptance becomes problematic when people never consider alternatives to borrowing for purchases. They optimize debt terms rather than avoiding debt when possible through savings. Meanwhile, cash buyers understand that debt avoidance often provides better financial outcomes. But something more sophisticated happens with mortgage marketing and homeownership promotion in society. The trap doesn't just normalize debt for property purchases through payment scheduling. It creates cultural beliefs that homeownership requires debt and represents financial achievement through leverage. Society develops beliefs that mortgages enable homeownership rather than recognizing that mortgages delay ownership. This cultural framework convinces people that debt creates ownership when debt actually prevents ownership. The normalization also prevents learning how wealthy families actually acquire property through cash. Meanwhile, cash buyers understand that debt delays ownership rather than enabling ownership effectively. They can purchase property without ongoing obligations to lenders or interest extraction over time. The mortgage trap handles what economists call interest rate manipulation, where borrowing costs get optimized. Mortgage companies offer variable rates, promotional periods, and refinancing incentives that appear beneficial. This optimization prevents people from calculating total interest costs over complete loan terms. Rate focus also prevents people from understanding how total interest compares to property values. Meanwhile, cash buyers avoid rate manipulation and focus on property value rather than rates. They can evaluate purchases based on property merit rather than financing terms. The mortgage trap also exploits what psychologists call equity building illusion in homeownership psychology. People believe mortgage payments create wealth through property ownership and equity accumulation over time. This illusion prevents recognition that interest payments often exceed equity building during years. Equity focus also prevents people from calculating opportunity costs of interest payments versus investments. Meanwhile, cash buyers can invest money that would have gone to interest payments. They can generate returns rather than paying banks for property financing over decades. But there's something even more sophisticated happening with mortgage structures and wealth transfer mechanisms. The trap doesn't just extract interest payments from homeowners through debt obligations and scheduling. It creates systematic wealth transfer from middle-class homeowners to financial institutions and investors. Mortgage payments represent ongoing wealth extraction that continues for decades without interruption or reduction. This extraction prevents homeowners from building wealth through property ownership while enriching financial institutions. The payments also prevent capital accumulation that could be invested in additional properties. Meanwhile, wealthy investors often acquire multiple properties through cash purchases and rental income. They can build property portfolios rather than paying interest on single property purchases. The mortgage trap addresses what behavioral economists call payment size focus and affordability evaluation. People evaluate mortgages based on monthly payment amounts rather than total costs over terms. This focus prevents recognition that total interest often equals or exceeds property. Payment thinking also prevents people from understanding how cash purchases provide immediate savings. Meanwhile, cash buyers calculate total costs and understand immediate ownership advantages. They can avoid interest obligations rather than optimizing payment terms and schedules. The mortgage trap also exploits what economists call leverage misunderstanding in property investment strategies. People believe that mortgage leverage amplifies returns when property values increase over time. This misunderstanding prevents recognition that leverage also amplifies risks and costs through obligations. Leverage illusion also prevents people from understanding that cash purchases often provide returns. Meanwhile, wealthy buyers understand that leverage costs often exceed leverage benefits for property. They can avoid leverage risks rather than hoping for leverage gains through appreciation. But perhaps most insidious involves how mortgage marketing affects homeownership timeline, expectations, and planning. People who use mortgages expect homeownership to require decades of payments and obligations. This timeline prevents recognition that cash purchases provide immediate ownership and freedom. Mortgage also creates what economists call ownership confusion, where payments substitute for ownership. People believe making payments equals building ownership, when payments primarily serve lenders. Meanwhile, cash buyers understand that ownership requires eliminating obligations rather than creating payment. The mortgage trap creates payment addiction, where people cannot imagine homeownership without debt obligations. This addiction prevents consideration of cash purchase options that provide immediate ownership advantages. Payments become associated with homeownership rather than wealth extraction by financial institutions. Meanwhile, cash buyers understand that homeownership means eliminating payments rather than making payments. They can achieve ownership rather than payment obligations that transfer wealth to lenders. The mortgage trap works by providing immediate homeownership access through debt, while extracting wealth decades. It allows people to feel like homeowners while remaining obligated to lenders. The system provides housing access while creating long-term wealth extraction and financial obligations. People experience homeownership satisfaction while transferring wealth to banks through interest payments effectively. Meanwhile, actual ownership requires eliminating debt obligations rather than creating payment schedules. The trap perpetuates because people who complete mortgage payments often had advantages. They become advocates for mortgage financing while overlooking cash purchase advantages that work. The successful examples obscure homeowners who achieved ownership through different approaches to financing. And remarkably, the mortgage trap has convinced people that cash purchases are impossible. When examining property acquisition reveals that cash purchases often provide superior outcomes. Mortgage users need cash accumulation strategies rather than just debt optimization for ownership. The mortgage trap represents one of the most effective mechanisms for converting homeownership into wealth. It transforms property ownership into ongoing profit streams for financial institutions and lenders. Understanding this trap doesn't mean avoiding homeownership, but recognizing debt costs versus ownership. It means prioritizing cash accumulation while understanding mortgage alternatives for property acquisition. If you want analysis of how mortgage systems create wealth extraction rather than equity, subscribe to Prof. Zhang Explained. Share this with someone making 30-year mortgage payments to banks. They need understanding why cash purchases provide superior ownership outcomes than debt financing. The mortgage trap also creates what economists call payment dependency in homeownership relationships and expectations. People become accustomed to mortgage payments as permanent rather than temporary property costs. This dependency prevents recognition that ownership means eliminating payments rather than making payments. Payment acceptance also prevents people from prioritizing cash accumulation for property purchases without debt. Meanwhile, cash buyers understand that ownership requires eliminating obligations rather than creating payment. They can achieve ownership rather than payment schedules that transfer wealth continuously. Consider how your relationship with homeownership changed when viewing it as debt versus asset. Did mortgage obligations feel like building ownership or serving financial institutions over time? The mortgage trap exploits what psychologists call ownership timeline confusion in property acquisition expectations. People believe homeownership takes decades to mortgage payments rather than recognizing immediate ownership. This timeline confusion prevents understanding that cash purchases provide instant ownership advantages. Gradual thinking also prevents people from calculating total costs of extended payment schedules effectively. Meanwhile, cash buyers understand immediate ownership advantages and avoid timeline confusion through payments. They can benefit from ownership rather than working toward ownership over decades. The mortgage trap creates what sociologists call middle-class programming, where homeownership expectations get managed. People learn to expect mortgage debt as normal homeownership path rather than questioning alternatives. This programming prevents pursuit of cash purchase strategies that seem unrealistic but accessible. Class programming also prevents people from understanding how wealthy families actually acquire property effectively. Meanwhile, cash buyers learn property acquisition strategies that wealthy families use for ownership. They can implement wealth building rather than just debt management for property. But there's something even more sophisticated about how mortgage marketing affects property investment thinking. The trap doesn't just normalize debt for homeownership through payment acceptance and scheduling. It prevents people from understanding property as investment rather than just personal housing. Property investment requires understanding cash flow, appreciation, and total return calculations rather than affordability. This investment blindness prevents people from evaluating property purchases strategically based on value. The focus also prevents learning how wealthy families use property for wealth rather than shelter. Meanwhile, cash buyers can evaluate property as investment opportunity rather than just housing. They can calculate returns and make strategic decisions based on property value rather than affordability. The mortgage trap handles what economists call interest rate fixation in financing evaluation and optimization. People focus on securing lowest possible interest rates rather than avoiding interest entirely. This rate optimization prevents questioning whether debt financing serves their long-term wealth building. Rate thinking also prevents people from calculating how rate savings compare to elimination. Meanwhile, cash buyers avoid rate optimization by eliminating interest costs completely through ownership. They can focus on property value rather than financing terms and conditions. The mortgage trap also exploits what behavioral economists call equity building illusion in homeownership psychology. People believe mortgage payments create wealth through property ownership and equity accumulation gradually. This illusion prevents recognition that early payments primarily benefit lenders rather than homeowners. Equity focus also prevents people from calculating how equity building compares to investing. Meanwhile, cash buyers can invest money that would have gone to interest payments. They can generate returns rather than paying banks for property financing over time. The mortgage trap addresses what psychologists call affordability focus, where monthly payments determine purchase decisions. People evaluate property based on payment amounts rather than total costs over terms. This focus prevents recognition that total interest often equals property purchase prices. Payment evaluation also prevents people from understanding how cash purchases provide immediate savings. Meanwhile, cash buyers calculate total costs and understand ownership advantages immediately without obligations. They can avoid payment focus and evaluate property based on actual value. But perhaps most devastating involves how mortgage structures affect wealth building timeline and accumulation. The mortgage trap creates debt normalization, where borrowing feels responsible rather than wealth limiting. People become comfortable with mortgage obligations because debt seems normal for property ownership. This comfort prevents consideration of cash accumulation strategies that enable debt-free ownership. Debt acceptance becomes problematic when people never consider alternatives to borrowing for purchases. They optimize debt terms rather than avoiding debt when possible through accumulation. Meanwhile, cash buyers understand that debt avoidance often provides better financial outcomes. But there's something even more sophisticated happening with mortgage promotion and homeownership cultural programming. The trap doesn't just normalize debt for property purchases through payment scheduling acceptance. It creates cultural beliefs that homeownership represents achievement, even when debt obligations continue. Society develops beliefs that mortgage payments represent building wealth rather than serving lenders effectively. This cultural framework convinces people that debt payments create ownership when payments primarily. The normalization also prevents learning how wealthy families actually acquire property through cash. Meanwhile, cash buyers understand that debt payments delay ownership rather than building ownership. They can achieve property ownership without enriching financial institutions through interest extraction over time. The mortgage trap also creates what economists call refinancing addiction, where people constantly optimize terms. Refinancing appears beneficial because new terms seem better than existing payment obligations. This optimization prevents recognition that refinancing often extends profitable periods for lenders. Refinancing focus also prevents people from understanding how loan extensions affect total costs. Meanwhile, cash buyers avoid refinancing complexity and maintain ownership without ongoing optimization requirements. They can focus on property management rather than debt management over time. The mortgage trap addresses what behavioral economists call leverage, misunderstanding, and property investment evaluation. People believe mortgage leverage amplifies returns when property values increase over decades. This misunderstanding prevents recognition that leverage also amplifies risks and costs through obligations. Leverage illusion also prevents people from understanding that cash purchases often provide returns. Meanwhile, cash buyers understand that leverage costs often exceed leverage benefits for property. They can avoid leverage risks rather than hoping for leverage gains through appreciation. But there's something more sophisticated about how the mortgage trap handles property ownership psychology. The mortgage trap also exploits what economists call opportunity cost blindness in financing decisions. People cannot calculate returns on money that goes to interest payments versus investments. This blindness prevents recognition that interest payments often exceed potential investment returns significantly. Cost blindness also prevents people from evaluating whether cash purchases provide better wealth outcomes. Meanwhile, cash buyers can calculate opportunity costs and understand immediate ownership advantages effectively. They can compare property ownership to other investment options rather than just affordability. The mortgage trap creates financial planning distortion, where property payments consume disproportionate household income. Mortgage obligations prevent capital accumulation that could generate additional income and wealth building. This planning prevents diversification and limits financial flexibility through payment requirements. Income allocation also prevents people from building wealth outside property through other investments. Meanwhile, cash buyers can allocate income toward multiple wealth-building opportunities rather than payment. They can diversify wealth rather than concentrating in single property with obligations. But perhaps the most insidious aspect involves how mortgage systems affect generational wealth planning. People who use mortgages often cannot accumulate capital for additional property purchases. This accumulation prevents building property portfolios that provide ongoing income and generational wealth. Mortgage dependency also prevents people from understanding how property creates generational wealth through ownership. Meanwhile, cash buyers can build property portfolios and create generational assets rather than payment. They can transfer ownership rather than debt obligations to future generations. Understanding this trap doesn't mean avoiding homeownership, but recognizing debt costs versus ownership. It means prioritizing cash accumulation while understanding mortgage alternatives for property acquisition successfully. If you want analysis of how mortgage systems create wealth extraction rather than equity, subscribe to Prof. John Explained. Share this with someone making 30-year mortgage payments to banks. They need understanding why cash purchases provide superior ownership outcomes than debt financing.